today we get to chat through one of your articles that you've written. And this article is an article that is kind of heavy. It's a really heavy article, and I'm excited to talk through it with you and hear kind of your thoughts behind it. So this article is called Trauma and Self-Harm, Why They Coincide. And so we're going to just talk through that a little bit. And I want to start with kind of a basic question. Who did you write this article to, and what inspired you to write it?
Yeah. Thank you so much for that question because I had a specific client type that I was writing to and some inspiration for this article. And specifically, I have quite a few clients who struggle with trauma and self harm. And so I wrote it for them and their families. And I just have noticed how much shame and guilt there is around both of these topics. And so my inspiration was just to give them a voice and help them feel understood and help um, their families, their friends understand this. And then ultimately to reduce the stigma, because there's so much stigma specifically around self harm. And so I want people to feel like they can have a voice, they can seek help without all of this shame and guilt getting in the way, and we can work on it through therapy.
Yeah, and I love that you also touch on, family and friends, it also being written for them, because I think that that can be a really hard situation to be in when you don't understand what that person is experiencing. So I love that you wrote it for them as well.
Yeah.
Let's start by just giving me a basic overview of really just self-harm. What is it? Why can it occur?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so broad definition of self-harm is just purposely harming yourself through the one that you hear talked about a lot is cutting, but we also consider like burning yourself, hitting yourself, maybe picking your skin, punching yourself, banging your head as all ways that you could self-harm. And for some people, they may question some of those, and that may be hard to hear that maybe picking skin and other types of things are self-harm, but there's also kind of ranges to it, and that some behaviors with certain disorders can be repetitive, like picking up hair, things like that. But then there's also the behaviors that can be maybe more severe, like with the cutting or the burning and those types of things. So that's just kind of a broad definition of where we put the self harm. But why does it happen? Why do people engage in it? And there can be a lot of reasons for that. So, a lot of times I see people who are experiencing so much emotion, difficult emotions, they don't know what to do with it. And so, self harm is a way to get that emotion out, to have a physical manifestation of that emotion. Also, there are people that I work with that they're so numb, they cut themselves just to feel. Um, Also, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but they want to communicate their pain to people. They want people to know that they're struggling and maybe they don't have words for that. It can also be a distraction. Maybe there's so much going on in life that this is a way to distract themselves.
Yeah, yeah. Could you, and you talked a little bit about this, that, it can look like a variety of things, not just, necessarily cutting, which is probably the one that we think of typically.
Yeah, yeah.
But could you be doing self-harm, experiencing that without even realizing it, almost like a nervous tick, a nervous tendency that you do?
Sure, sure. I mean, it is possible. Most people, if it's becoming um, an area where they're really struggling with it, they'll know that they're doing it. If someone's like picking their skin, it may not get to the self harm level because they feel somewhat in control, or that it doesn't happen all the time, or maybe their purpose isn't like to hurt themselves. It's just kind of repetitive. There is a possibility, but most people know I'm hurting myself for a reason.
Right. Yeah. So let's kind of go into kind of the connection between trauma and self-harm. I thought this was so interesting. You touch on it in your article that the Greek word for trauma is wound. And I just think that that's really interesting. So how common is it for people who have experienced trauma, who are experiencing trauma, to also be experiencing self-harm?
Yeah. Yeah, with talking about wound, I use that quote by Diane Langberg because I love that word picture of trauma being a wound. Because people who have experienced trauma, especially like sexual trauma or assault or just a traumatic experience, there's so much shame with it and they turn in on themselves. There's something wrong with me. I did something wrong. And it helps to look at it as a wound, just like a physical wound, that if we got hurt and we had to go to the hospital, before they could bandage, before they could stitch up the wound, you have to clean it out. And there's gonna be some pain there. And you know that with a physical wound. And then they clean it and they maybe stitch it up, bandage it. That's same with some trauma work. You're gonna experience some pain as you work through it, but there is going to be healing. Healing is possible. And so, with your question about self harm, trauma and self harm don't always go together. But we do see it a lot with people who have experienced maybe sexual abuse or sexual trauma, just because of how they view themselves, how they view their body after that. So we don't always see it, but it is more common with trauma. So that's something when someone has experienced a traumatic experience, we ask about that. We make that something that they know they can talk about. And if they've experienced that, we need to talk about it.
Yeah, and you mentioned self-harm sometimes being used almost as a coping mechanism for those who have experienced trauma. And I find that's just so interesting, as someone who hasn't experienced this, as someone who hasn't walked through that kind of trauma and that kind of response to trauma, that harming yourself could come out like almost like you think it's going to heal you. How does hurting
Yeah,
yourself feel like coping? So can you kind of expand on just the coping mechanism part of that?
yeah, definitely. Yeah, first off, I think it's important to say, yeah, it becomes a coping mechanism. It's not a healthy one. They may say it's helping them, but ultimately, as a professional, in the long run, it's not. But seeing what their purpose is for it is helpful. And with trauma, it overwhelms us and what we know about ourselves in the world. And what that person used to use as effective coping skills a lot of times don't work anymore. And so they use this self harm as a very tangible way to manage emotions or be able to stay in the moment, kind of ground themselves when they feel like they might be dissociating into the trauma or with difficult emotions. Also, it can be something that they use to numb the emotions. They're feeling so much that I would rather distract myself. I'd rather feel this than have to go into all these deep emotions that I don't know what's going to happen if I go into those. Um, Also, it can be a sense of wanting to control their body because if it's like a sexual trauma or an assault, they didn't have control in that situation. And so they're trying to control their body through this mechanism.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you kind of touch on one other point within the article of it also being nonverbal communication. So can you kind of expand on that idea too?
Definitely. Yeah. I talked about in the article, one thing I always ask my clients that struggle with self harm is just what would the cut say if they could speak? Because it is a physical way that the person is trying to communicate. And some people do that more where they cut where it can be seen, and others where it can't be seen. So some of that is more blatant communication than others. Um, and a lot of times with the self-harm and with the pain that they're experiencing, they don't have words for it. And this is the only way they can maybe feel like they can express that. They're feeling so much pain that they would maybe they don't experience the pain of the self-harm as much as maybe they would before it, or they rather feel that than the intensity of the emotions. Um, it could also communicate the shame and the guilt. Like something's happened. I don't have the words for it. I don't know what to do with this. Please help me. And they don't know how to communicate that maybe to their loved ones or maybe that they would be accepting of that. And just unfortunately our society has kind of viewed self-harm as a certain way, and it can be hard to talk about that, be open about that, and ask for help about it. And so that's another reason for this article, is just to give light to the importance of communication around it. And if we see someone we love, a friend struggling, it's okay to open up and talk about it.
Yeah. So cognitive distortions is one of the things that you mention in your article. Can you kind of talk a little bit about what that is?
Yeah. Yeah. So a cognitive distortion is a belief that we have that internally we believe is true. But if we would say it to other people, they would kind of be like, what are you talking about? That's definitely not true. How can you not believe that? Or how can you believe that's true when it's not? And in the article, I talked about a few cognitive distortions that are so common with people who have trauma and self-harm. And one of the very common ones is no one could truly love me if they knew what had happened. And that is one that really runs deep. And with this one, I just acknowledge, I try to be someone that when they share these things with me, sit with them in it and know that when they share this with me, that doesn't change how I feel or see them. And I hope that if they would share that with any friends or family, that they would have that same response. Also, another cognitive distortion with like trauma, self-harm, um, are just that they are flawed, they're bad, they're incompetent, their body is disgusting. And so if you think about that belief, then you can kind of understand why someone would hurt their body if they see it that way, almost like a form of punishment, which even just saying that or even walking with someone through that, it hurts you so much because you don't want them to do that. But just trying to understand where they're coming from. And then the last distortion that I talked about was that there's something wrong with them. And that's heartbreaking too, when someone who's experienced trauma, when they feel like it's something wrong with them, that this happened to them because of this, or if it's an assault, that it was their fault. And it's so hard to hear that, and helping them walk through those beliefs and helping them come to like their body again, like themselves again.
Yeah. So say that there is someone who is tuning in today, who is watching this video, listening in. What would you say to someone who is a loved one of someone who is struggling with self-harm? What can be done? How can they come alongside and love that person well?
Yeah, I would say, first of all, initiating conversation, something like, I really see that you're struggling. And I've seen that there's some things on your body that I just wondering if you'd like to talk about, or if you're struggling with self-harm. And I'm here to talk whenever you're ready. I want to talk about it. Um, and there's a piece of it, especially if there's like minors and things like that. If you have a child under 18, the parent kind of needs to assess, hey, how serious is this? Do we need to get immediate help? That is a piece of it as well. But I also think the conversation with anyone should be, I think it would be helpful for you to talk to someone who understands, who can help you with this. I will help you do that. I think the important thing to know is if a family member or you're someone struggling with self-harm, getting help, getting to a professional that knows how to treat this, how to work with this is a must, just because even though it is a coping mechanism, it's not a helpful one, and there's help.
Yeah, absolutely. And then on the other side of it, what would you say as a counselor, words of encouragement, maybe advice to someone who is watching this, who's tuning in, who is struggling, who they themselves are struggling with
Yeah.
self-harm?
Yeah, I would just say you're not alone. I see you. You can be seen, you can be known, you can be accepted. You can get through this. There is help, and don't give up on the work that you want to do and getting through the trauma and getting through the self harm. Don't say, I'm going to do it tomorrow or another day, or I don't need help. Make sure that you get the help that you need, and know that you don't have to go through it alone, and you can still be accepted um, throughout your journey with trauma and self harm.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you guys, if you are tuning in today, thank you so much for listening in to September Trent as she kind of covers this article that she's written. And as she said, we just have a desire for you to live a full life, and a life just beaming with joy. And it's so hard, and we experience so many different things, different experiences in life, traumas that can make it so difficult. But we definitely desire just that safety for you. If you're tuning in and are struggling with this, please reach out to us. There's always someone willing and ready to sit and talk with you, September included. So thank you guys for listening in with that one. And September, thank you just for your tenderness and kind of covering that with us.